Welcome back to the Fullerton College Print Department Pre-Press Combined Beginning and Advanced course. Again, this is Ben Kiewit, your professor, and I'm going to continue on talking about the PIA Pre-Press Training Manual, Section 1.1, the Introduction to Graphic Communications and Design Considerations. Once again, the design considerations you want to take into account before you start printing are not things that you want to think about after you've started your design. It can be very hard to change course once you've set up to create something. If you started a design and you were going to make a business card, to suddenly be asked to turn that into a billboard is quite difficult because the requirements are very different. So we're going to carry on here, starting with paper. Paper, or as I learned at our school from Professor Hirth, substrate, because it's not always paper. These days with printing capabilities, printing on paper seems almost kind of quaint compared to some of the stuff you can print on. I mean, really, there's no limit at this point. There are presses and equipments available to put images on anything. It's a fun time to be a printer. Anyways, paper is still the primary choice. Most things still happen on paper. Most products are still mailed or bound into books or handed as brochures. And paper is cheaper than, say, sheets of aluminum to print on. So we stick to paper for a lot of things still. Some of the main categories that are available are uncoated paper, coated paper, newsprint, paperboard. Other things also involve corrugated cardboard is big for packaging, certain type of plastics papers, really cool kind of nylon-y polyester paper that can't be torn. It's like what they use for marathon runners' numbers that they wear in their shirts. Very thin, but nigh indestructible. The biggest two ones that are in use, the largest quantities of printing are done on either coated or uncoated paper. This is one of those good diagrams here, the image of the same halftone printing. Remember that we can't actually print anything but yes ink or no ink. We cannot print some ink or sort of ink. If you want to print a gray and you only have black ink, which most of us do, you have to print black and white black dots on a white background so that when you're far enough away or the dots are small enough, it looks and blends to your eye like an average of a gray. It looks very different between the coated and the uncoated. On the coated, which is the left, the edges are much better defined on those black dots. On the right side, those edges are kind of bled out. They kind of expand, like when you stick a Sharpie onto a paper towel, you just watch the ink seep out and grow and become a bigger, darker spot. So coated papers give you better images because the ink does not soak in as much. That also gives you better color because when it soaks into the paper, it kind of looks more pastel because you mix with the whitish color of the paper with your ink. And instead of just having your ink, you see a bit more of that coming through, and it's not what you expect. Uncoated stock, traditionally called offset stock, is paper that's made but does not have a coating. Fancy that. It's pretty popular for a lot of things because it is cheap. It doesn't cost any extra for a paper mill to just make uncoated paper because when you make paper, it is uncoated. You have to physically add a coating to get coated stock. It's also a good thing for newspapers and a lot of junk mails to print on uncoated because if you're printing with liquid ink, the fact that it's kind of spongy and absorbent actually helps the ink dry faster. And time is one of those resources you can never get back. Money comes and goes, but time only ever goes. Designers prefer coated papers. One, because people like shiny things, but mostly because the color looks so much better. As long as a client can afford the nicer paper, typically you want to go with a nicer paper, honestly. There's a few cases when uncoated matters. For instance, if there's any sort of fill-out form, you want to make sure it's uncoated. The glossiness of a coated paper makes it so that pen runs right off. Pencil won't even scrape against it. It's too smooth for a graphite pencil to leave a mark. Coated paper is really an infuriating thing to try and write on. So you want to stick to uncoated for anything that needs to be written on top of. Let's take a look. This is the best slide of this whole chapter. It's one of the best slides of the entire book. This is the money chart. This is it. Guys, if you learn nothing else from me this whole semester or the whole time at Fullerton College, this is it. This chart says it, and I can give you some words, but my goodness. One ink, many papers. You can see that whatever the color of the paper is matters to the final print job. Not just the color, but the physical properties, how well it holds against the ink, called ink holdout. How well does the ink sit on the surface versus soak in? So it's one of the big considerations of why it matters so much to think about paper before you start a project. I have seen paper physically change the color noticeably of printed jobs. It was even using Pantone colors at one point. I was doing some envelopes and some business cards for, I believe it was Bicycle Casino out in Commerce. And they have kind of a bluish and a goldish color that they print with. And we use the Pantone colors. We printed them on their shiny, glossy business cards for their employees. And we also printed the exact same colors on their 70-pound uncoated opaque envelopes. And that bright golden yellow turned into somewhere between ochre, mustard, and baby poop. They were not happy. Same ink, different paper. Consider the paper when you start. You don't want to have to try and consider it later. You will regret it. But don't worry. My job as an instructor here is to have gone into the world before you and made a ton of mistakes and kept notes. So you don't have to make my mistakes. You get to hear about them and chuckle at me. Much better option if you ask me. Now we're going to go on to bindery. The last thing that happens to a print job is bindery. It gets folded, it gets trimmed, it gets stapled, it gets put into books or made into brochures or folded into maps or rolled into tubes or die cut and glued together into boxes. Whatever happens, bindery is the last thing. But you have to understand this before you can start. You can't just take a brochure and say, yeah, that'll make a just fine shoebox. You really need to start, from the get-go, at the beginning, aiming in the right direction. Now, a lot of places, a lot of print shops have some bindery capability, but it's limited. Almost every shop out there is going to have a guillotine cutter and some sort of saddle stitcher. Those are everywhere. You probably also have some spiral binding because that's cheap and easy to have. Sometimes you'll have rounded corners and some folders and creasers and perforators. But beyond that, if you want specialty stuff, if you want to fold cool things or have interesting die cut edges, that's special work that has to go to a special shop. Anyways, the most basic thing you do in bindery is folding paper. One of the most ubiquitous print jobs, and one of the ones that if you get into this business, you are going to do all the time until you're tired of it, is tri-fold brochures. One single letter size paper, 8.5 by 11, folded into thirds, makes those little brochures that you get in the hotel lobbies when you're seeing what theme park to visit in that city. It also makes good things for schools to talk about classes and departments. Everybody uses them because it's a good way to divide up one single page to have way more information than you would otherwise be able to get on there. If you took the same amount of info that goes on a trifold and you just tried to print on a flat sheet of paper, you would bore the pants off of anybody reading it. They would fall asleep and get tired and bored of looking at your brochure. But by making it into 6 arbitrary smaller pages, suddenly you can consume all that information and it doesn't seem like such a bad task anymore. It's the difference between eating your information with a fork and a knife or trying to shove the whole cow in your mouth. Okay. So you have to make sure before you get started that your bindery is physically possible and also affordable. Some weird folds, like folding maps and doing strange zigzaggy accordion folds that go a mile long, can't be done everywhere. So as cool as the concept may be, as amazing as that design is going to be, if no one can do it or it has to be done extremely special, it's going to raise the cost and raise the time of the project. And you need to be aware of that going in. Otherwise, you're going to make promises that you can't follow through on. And really, once you've lost your reputation of someone with integrity, you're kind of done in the business. Non-creative people who purchase creative services are always wary of us. They always think of us as that, plumbing repair guy who's going to come and sit around and not work and charge you a lot of money. Why do you feel that way? Because you don't understand the process that they're doing. So they automatically distrust the creative folks, the people in the suits in the offices a lot of times. So you have to be more and have more integrity than normal and be more honest and annoyingly Boy Scouty, or I guess it's just Scouty now. Go Scouts for including everyone. Rock on, guys. Anyways, so you want to make sure that you're giving accurate time and money estimates. Otherwise, you're going to have unhappy customers. And unhappy customers, believe me, there are a lot of other options. They don't have to come to you. So folding paper is the most basic, but other things happen too. Anytime you put multiple sheets together, that's called binding. You bind them together the way the one ring binds the other rings of lesser power. Sorry, not quite like that. I've been reading some books over the summer. Can you tell? Also, anything you do to make it better and more usable is a finishing method. So binding, you can saddle stitch, which is when you staple the edges. You can case bind or hard bind, and that's when you have a hardcover like a textbook or a novel that just got released before it reaches the paperback aisle at the grocery store. And that's called perfect binding when you reach the paper one. There's also things like ring binding, spiral binding, and comb binding, which are valid. They don't seem as nice as a properly case-bound book, but if you're doing something like a manual, I personally prefer spiral-bound manuals because they stay open and they lay flat. One of the things that drives me nuts as a nerd gamer hobbyist is when all the game manuals come in these nice case-bound editions with shiny covers and nice covers, is they don't lay open. If you need to leave it open to a chart so you know how to play the game you're playing, you want to have that reference material available. You don't want to have to keep opening the book and potentially damaging the binding for trying to force it open. Usability. Think about the end user when you're making things. Other things you can do in finishing, you can die cut, which is when you have basically a very sharp cookie cutter used on an old letterpress to slam into the paper and cut out shapes. Everything on this page are die cuts. That's not a real outdated cell phone. That's a piece of paper cut to look like one. I really like that oil bottle too, and the giant dime, which is also fun. Die cutting is great. We have ways of sampling that in our lab. If we get to work together this semester or in the future, we will play with my die cutting system because it is a lot of fun to work with. Embossing or debossing is when you raise or lower parts of the thing. You can foil stamp, which puts foil on the paper. You can laminate. Teachers love that option, let me tell you. If I ever get a laminator in the lab, I will do favors all day and night because everybody loves that stuff. But all that costs money. Adding coatings, adding special effects to your papers, that all costs more and costs more time. And that needs to be considered from the beginning. Also, you can't suddenly create a die cut project out of a project that wasn't meant to be die cut. It will never line up proper. So again, you have to know the end from the beginning. Lastly, I think, if I remember correctly, mailing requirements. Support your post office. They're an important service to American life. A lot of things get sent out in the mail. More than ever, I've been noticing all the junk mail that gets sent. You'll notice that when everyone's home and only some people are working, they are still sending junk mail all the time. And there's a lot of business in junk mail. How do I know this? Because before I started teaching in this college, the last 5 years I spent in pure production in the industry, I worked for a junk mail place. And I produced a lot of mailing postcards and brochures that got sent on behalf of places like YMCA all over Southern California. So with mailing, you really have to pay attention to the postal regulations. They will give you a sweet discount and a good price to mail something so long as you follow systems that their computers and their scanners are able to handle. This involves very specific sizes and very specific tolerances. Here's a sample of a postcard. You can see that you have very specific amounts of space. You're allowed to put the indicia, which is like the stamp that says prepaid postage. You can only put the address in so much of space. You can only leave a barcode in so much space. A barcode they provide you through a special service that you pay for. It has to be very, very persnicketily perfect or it's rejected. No kidding. One time I did a mailing job at my last job, and the guy in the bindery was having an off day, and he cut the postcards 1/32 of an inch too small. And the guy at the post office sent them back and said, reprint, we won't mail these. So find out what they want and follow it. They will charge you more money or cancel your job if you don't meet their specifications. And lastly, when you're all done with your design, you go on to reproduce it. It's either reproduced by being printed, it's reproduced by being burned to DVDs or sent onto the internet or released as a mobile app to cell phones. But in the end, whatever environment it was meant for, you send it off and you say goodbye with a tearful farewell and you get ready to work on the next customer's project. That is it for this section. Thank you for following along. I know it's a bit of a long one, but at least it was 3 shorter videos, right? I look forward to seeing you guys in Zoom and in person. Thank you so much for bearing with me.